I mean, I've spoken to a variety of different leaders in this series from different backgrounds and different walks of life, and one thing that comes up a fair amount is the question of success and failure, and doing things perfectly, and whether leadership is about that or not. And I read a comment on LinkedIn the other day from a leader, and I have to read it here off my screen, but they said, showing up fearlessly often outweighs flawless execution, especially in leadership. How might we build cultures that reward courage over perfection? What's your take on that? Do you agree with that sentiment, or do you disagree with that?
Yeah, I would largely agree with it. I think we can often get paralyzed in the pursuit of flawless execution, right? If there even is such a thing as flawless execution, we can be bound by kind of constraints that we may impose upon ourselves, or that our bosses have imposed upon us. That can really inhibit creativity, bind us to kind of process, and sort of like making sure that we execute in a certain way can also stagnate ideas as well, all in the name of perfection, which I think, sometimes we need to really reflect on and think, is that really the right thing to do? But showing up fearlessly, though, we all want to be bold and courageous and show up, with that trait. But one thing I've seen in my career as well is that has to be with substance to it too. I think we've all seen those kind of characters in a meeting, or, in our workplace, that appear to be fearless and bold. But actually, when you listen to what they're saying, they might actually lack a bit of substance or lack a bit of depth there. So I think, showing up fearlessly isn't enough. You also need to have the depth and the substance there to kind of back that. I think as a leader, it is important to show up courageously and have those kind of outspoken moments and be fearless. And it can take the guise of different forms, right? It might not be necessarily standing up in a meeting and showing fearlessness. It might be making a decision to stop doing something and start doing something else. But being courageous enough to kind of take that step is what's required from a leadership standpoint. I think, so I would largely agree that actually, showing up fearlessly probably does outweigh flawless execution. And I think, that kind of fearlessness in terms of the cultural side of it will foster naturally, if your leader is showing up like that, a culture of optimism and sort of positivity and the ability to try new ideas. If your leader is saying, let's make a different decision, or let's be courageous and talk about this, rather than I need you to execute flawlessly. So I think a culture of experimentation may naturally form as a result of that. So I do largely agree, but I don't think it's as black and white as one or the other. So yeah, but a very profound statement indeed, and a very kind of thought-provoking quote for sure.
It is, and I have thought about this long and hard as well. And we've had different guests on with different opinions. For example, Charles McLaughlin, who is the founder of the CEO Growth Academy. He talks about the fact that we can't control everything. So being fearless is okay, but I think the way, and not putting words in his mouth, but I think the way he would probably look at it would be have a sense of vulnerability in areas that you can't control, and acceptance of that situation, and then dealing with that. And if we, I guess, look forward to that on the point of fearlessness, as you, I think, alluded to as well, you can't afford to be then, for that to turn into arrogance and to be blinkered by, I'm fearless, I'll go for it, but then actually you're charging in a direction that's probably not helpful. Just talking about, we talked about perfection or flawless execution there, and I suppose as leaders we're often held to a higher standard to a degree, and if we think about perfection is impossible, and invariably there are times when we do fail. How do you personally approach the topic of failure, and how do you communicate with you mentioned your teams as well, how do you communicate with your teams on that topic?
Failure is a really interesting one because, no one really likes talking about. No one wants to fail. You certainly don't, set out to fail at all. But there comes a point in time where you realize it's actually part of your journey. And you actually can acknowledge failure as a positive. It's almost like a gift, right? At least something is not working or something is not going the way you want it to. And you actually have the ability to do something about it. The challenge comes when you actually don't do anything about it, or you don't know that you're failing. So I often tell my teams consistently, you need to be reflecting on what's working, what's not working, but be honest with yourselves. If this was in the world of marketing, which is what I lead here, we often have a marketing budget that we invest in different programs and different activities. And we need to be honest, is it truly working for this, and not be beholden to, some sense of pride that I don't want to be seen to be failing. It's actually more detrimental to be holding on to something that necessarily isn't working. We need to be prepared to drop things. Giving ourselves enough time to assess and to test. And, what I always try and tell my teams is, before we do make a bold decision, coming back to being fearless and being bold, if you are going to drop something, we do need to look at the impact of that. Whilst it may not be working in one aspect, what are the holes that it does leave? How are those being plugged by other activities or other tasks? Or, what is the impact of it? It doesn't mean you necessarily hold on to something, but it does mean that you do need to plan for what may be a gap that is left by dropping something. So failure is part of our journey. I think it's something that does need to be spoken about openly amongst team, coming back to that culture where it's not hidden. It's part of, what you're reviewing and part of the discussion. But I do think, you do need to have that kind of balanced approach to looking at what's working and what's not working, to keep doing what you're always doing just because you've always done it. I think they say it's the first sign of madness or something, but it's always, often as well, a waste of everyone's time and money from a marketing standpoint. So just being honest with yourselves, I think is something I try and instill in my team.